Chapter 2, continuing on page 46. He waved it away, not a good sign. Your absence was adequately explained, he began in his unusually high-pitched voice. After all, patients must come first. He paused. Do you not agree? Of course, sir. She tried to think of something to say, to ease the tension she felt emanating from across the desk. The party was marvelous, she said timidly. And your house is beautiful. He nodded curtly. Yes, the party. He paused a long time. Are you happy here? Yes, sir, very happy. You would not prefer perhaps a more exciting practice, perhaps in London, New York, or Los Angeles? No, sir. It was worse than she thought. She swore to herself that if she got out of this okay, she would banish impulsiveness from her vocabulary, as well as that dim red dress. At times I wonder, he said softly. He swiveled in his chair so that he could look out the large bay window with his view of the grounds behind the main building. By the by, you appeared most striking last night. What I believe you Americans call a real eye-catcher. Banished and burned in a public square, sequin by bloody sequin. He was waiting for her to say something. I had some difficulties with my cleaners, she lied poorly. Tabbert nodded. I told several of the staff that is what must have happened, something like that. He let out a short, high-pitched squeal, which she had come to recognize as his laugh. I told them you would not intentionally come into my home dressed as a common prostitute. He paused, turning to face her, definitely not smiling. You would not deliberately embarrass yourself, your colleagues, this institution. He paused again. Myself, in that matter? Of course not, she said, as she felt herself growing more and more furious in the face of that unforgiving, mean-spirited gaze. Of course not. Dr. Nowen, let us be completely forthright with each other, yes? Of course, she said louder than she'd intended. You are, madam, a brilliant, perhaps gifted practitioner. Your clinical record is beyond reproach, but it is in the other areas beyond the clinic where I feel that you are not institute material. Really? Her voice was flat, angry, but with the submerged, building anger that was being held tightly under control. For now, anyway. This silly affair last night, flaunting your, physicality, I will be blunt. He leaned forward, hands folded on the desk in front of him. There were many present, myself included, who felt that your deportment reflected poorly upon yourself and the institute that you represent. Really, she seized on her anger at her own personal failings and turned them on Tabbert. As her father used to say, if you're going to get shot, better be shot for a grizzly than a pig. Who exactly? Your pardon? Well, she said bitterly, I seem to recall quite a few approving reactions. She smiled, particularly from several men on senior staff. Tabbert looked embarrassed, which I will be taking up with them later this day, but it is you we are discussing at this moment. She interrupted him. Yes, it is. You admit my work is more than adequate. Brilliant, gifted. I believe those were the words you used. Tabbert seemed off balance. Within these walls, yes, but... Patricia shook her head and leaned forward, resting her palms on the shiny desk. That's what you pay me for. That work. If that isn't enough, that's too bad. Excuse, please? What the hell, she thought. Maybe a change is exactly what I need. God knows nothing here. Nothing seems to be going right for me here. If what I do, she said icily, or how I do it ever impacts on my work here, I assure you you'll have my letter of resignation immediately. But until then, either accept my brilliant, gifted work and what goes with it, or fire me here and now, you misogynistic bastard. She leaned back in her seat, breathing heavily. Tabbert gripped the edge of his desk so hard that his knuckles turned white and his wrists shook. His teeth were clenched and a muscle was working convulsively in his right cheek. I have never been spoken to in such a fashion, he wheezed out. Patricia looked at him, trying to decide if she'd prefer teaching at some Midwestern med school, or maybe a mental health clinic in California. In scant seconds, she thought she'd be free to do either. Whatever, she knew she'd gone too far to back down now. Tabbert seemed to pull himself together. Dr. Nowen, he said, taking deep breaths. If it were left to me, you would not finish the day, but unlike yourself, I must subordinate to my personal desires to the good of the Institute. You are not the sort of person we wish to have here, but the board of directors believes, rather naively in my opinion, that your gender has been discriminated against inappropriately, and so you are here. There is nothing I can do about that." He stood up, walking over to his window. "There are also certain realities of a more material nature I must take into account." He paused for a long time. Finally, he turned back to her. "I cannot conceive why. Perhaps you are sleeping with someone influential, but your presence has been requested by Dr. Clemente on a special project he is overseeing. You may report to him immediately. Thank you for your time." Patricia sat there, stunned. Jack. Good old Jack had come through after all. She almost jumped from her seat before heading for the door. "Dr. Nelwyn," she stopped, turning back to him, "when you fail at this fool's task the Americans are paying for, rest assured you will be dismissed from this institution, without a word of protest from the board, I'm sure." Patricia smiled at him. "Is that all?" She was anxious to run down to Jack's office. "One other thing," Tabbert said slowly. "If any of my words or my tone have caused you offense, my apologies." She shook her head at the man's hypocrisy and hurried from the office. 10 minutes later, she almost knocked Clemente over as she burst into his office. "Jack, you beautiful, brilliant, terrific person," she said happily as she embraced him. "You left out sexy," he said as he peeled her off him. She kissed him on both cheeks. "Whatever you say." She paused and looked up at him. "Thank you." Jack held up his hands. "Not me." Patricia looked puzzled. "Then who?" She followed his gaze across the room, unconsciously taking a step back when she saw Beck sitting in a chair against a wall. He stood up and walked over to them. "What I was trying to say," Jack began, "is that it wasn't my decision." She looked from Jack to Beck. "I don't understand." Beck shrugged. "You seem the right person for the job, Dr. Nelwyn." She took a step toward him. "But last night I thought I'd made an ass of myself. In fact, I've just been told as much." Beck looked confused. "Tabbert," Jack chimed in. Beck nodded, then checked his watch. "Time for explanations later. Right now we have a plane to catch." In confused silence, she followed the two men out. 10 hours later, on the Czech frontier in the small German town of Gorlitz, they stood on the German side of the border, leaning on an ambulance. They blew on their hands to keep warm in the sudden fog. Explanations had been brief, and the closer they had gotten to their destination, the more closed-mouthed Beck had become. For the last 2 hours he hadn't said a word, just stood in front of the ambulance, staring across the border. Patricia looked around. When they arrived, they had been met by a squad of heavily armed American soldiers. Beck had spoken to them briefly, and they had melted away into the shadows. But every few minutes she thought she could hear a rustle or a sound as one of them moved to a better position. "Is all this really necessary?" she asked Jack in a whisper. "I thought the wall came down a few years ago. You know, peaceful coexistence." Jack nodded. "Between nations, yeah. With the people, it's sometimes not so peaceful." He stopped as the sound of a truck filled the air. A moment later, it could be seen pulling to a stop on the Czech side of the border. A man in uniform got out and walked across the border. Patricia flinched as she heard the unmistakable sound of automatic rifles being cocked around her. Beck walked up to the man. "Alexander Beck?" "Major Valery Vitenka." Vitenka handed Beck a thick folder. They spoke in low tones for a couple of minutes, then Vitenka turned and waved to the truck. It started slowly across, pulling to a stop 5 meters from the ambulance. Beck walked to the back of the truck and beamed a flashlight inside. Nodding to Vitenka, he walked back to the ambulance. Patricia watched spellbound as the back gate was dropped and a man inched forward from the truck steps. Chained hand and foot, chains running from his neck to his waist, he was helped down by 2 Russian soldiers, who immediately picked up their rifles, pointing them at the man. The man looked around, then slowly shuffled toward the ambulance. The men with the rifles, joined by 2 others from the truck's cab, also aiming at the man, seemed, to Patricia's trained eye, to be as tense as any man she had ever seen. By contrast, the man in the chains seemed loose and relaxed. Vitenka watched the man shuffle past, then turned, heading back for the truck. "Major Vitenka," Beck called after him. "Yes." "The keys, sir." Vatenka seemed to hesitate, then reached into his pocket, lightly tossing a keyring to Beck's feet. I assume, General Beck, that you have men deployed under cover, as I do. He paused, taking a deep breath. If you unlock him before my men and I are well clear of this place, my snipers will cut him down. He turned, striding quickly back to the truck. A moment later, it sped away. Beck stood in silence next to the chained man. The others formed a half circle around them, stood quietly, tensely. Do it now. Beck thought it would be so easy. In fact, 2 U.S. Ranger snipers, covertly placed on the Czech side of the border, had already leveled their nearly invisible ultraviolet targeting dots on Newman's head and chest. Their spotters watched Beck's left hand for the tiniest movement that would be their go code. Beck knew it was the right thing to do, had argued to his superiors that it was the only thing to do, but they didn't or wouldn't understand and had overruled him. Newman must be kept alive. But accidents happen, Beck thought. A single shot in the night from the hostile side of the border, the thing easily explained to Washington, to the Russians, to Beck's God. The true irony, Beck knew, was that it would end that way. There was no other possible conclusion to this nightmare. So why not end it here, on this cold, damp street? Stop the otherwise inescapable tragedy, save the inevitable victims. Through his death, spare Newman himself. So, Alex, Newman looked deeply into Beck's soul. Beck desperately wanted to look away, to avoid seeing the grotesquerie play itself out in front of him, but he couldn't look away from those intense, questioning, accusing eyes. He took a deep breath and signaled. Patricia watched in fascination as keys were matched to locks, and Newman was set free. Throughout, he never made a sound. With the removal of the last chain and restraining strap, Newman slowly straightened. For 5 minutes, he soundlessly stretched cramped muscles. Then, as suddenly as he had started, he stopped and turned to Beck. Did he say General? Newman said softly. Beck nodded slightly. For a couple of years now. Beck paused. How are you, Brian? Newman shook his head sadly. General, well, he said as he turned away, I'm sure your men earned the stars for you. He turned, spotting Jack and Patricia for the first time. Who are they? Beck put his hand on Newman's shoulder. They're here to help. Newman looked down at the hand, then back at Beck. Help me? Who are you?